ugly video, the longest, goriest, and ugliest we've ever done. And I've never been so excited because of all the shit we've learned this week. And some of it is going to be me falling desperately on my sword. Let's talk a little bit about solar. I'm getting into solar, and we're having a lot of fun. This is 5 Solar Edge grid tie inverters. They each have 16 Reno Solar 305 watt panels on them for a 24,400 watt system that's grid tied. That means it has no battery backup. It provides ostensibly for our power needs, although it has not done that. More on that in a minute. And it, if it makes more power than we need, it exports it to the grid, and we ostensibly offset our usage at 12.58 cents per kilowatt hour. And if we produce more than we use for the month, we actually get paid 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour, avoided production costs by the utility company. And the reason I talk about this, we had this installed 4 years ago at a cost of $63,000, which is $2.58 a watt hour. And because of some prior Ameren UE malfeasance, and as part of a negotiated settlement, they agreed with the state of Missouri to do a solar rebate program where they would provide $2 per DC watt hour for people that installed solar, and went through a whole bunch of paperwork. And I did all that. So we spent $63,000 on it. They gave me $48,800 in rebate, and all was right with the world. But it's representative of 97% of the residential and light industrial solar systems in the country. The latest figures are in. The United States has about 1.5 million solar installations now, with a cumulative 53.3 gigawatts of power, and we're growing at an alarming rate. The interesting thing is, of that 53, 15.5 gigawatts were installed in 2016, and 10 gigawatts, 10.6 maybe, were installed in 2017, and that's a 30% decrease. In 2017, we installed 2,227 megawatts of capacity in residences, and that's down 16% from 2016. Why the drop from 2016 to 2017? As you know, I don't like federal rebates and governmental interference and all this. I know all of you do, but eventually, as you get older and observe these things, you'll fall over to my way of thinking. And here's a good example. They had a 30% tax credit. That's not a deduction, that's a deduction from your tax for solar renewable energy installs. In 2016, that was set to lapse, to expire in 2017 or 18, maybe 2018. And so a lot of people were wanting to take advantage of it before it expired. They did not expect Donald Trump to renew it, and they expected it to be the end of the solar energy rebate federal tax credit. So a whole lot of people installed solar in 2016 simply to get in under the door. So that left 2017, a lot of the demand that would have been then had moved up to 2016. In 2017, they passed a new tax bill, and lo and behold, as it turns out, they retained the 30% tax credit. It does sunset to some degree, but it's like in 2020, it drops to 26%, and then, some other percent the next year, and so it gradually tapers off. But it has essentially been extended. That's why we had such a big bump in 2016, 10 gigawatts in 2017 is nothing to sneeze at. But I want you to understand that 3% of that 53 gigawatts of installed capacity has any form of solar energy storage. And when I say any form, picture a 20 kilowatt solar array with a 24 volt battery system that could provide power just to the refrigerator and the garage door for 25 minutes or something stupid. All of the battery backup of these grid-tied systems is generally stupid and weenie. The array I put in 1998 had 50 kilowatts of Trojan industrial deep cycle batteries. They cost $11,000. I never used them at all, and they went bad after 7 years. And that's the state of the lead acid batteries. Oh, by the way, I had about a half-acre rear deck on my house, and all of underneath of it was Trojan batteries, giving off a lovely aroma of hydrogen as they charged. But they only really came into effect in the case of a power outage, and we rarely had any. And so during the day, I would put grid-tied energy into the grid, and at night take it out, using the utility company as a battery. This is the kumbaya solar dream that I'm declaring dead, stupid, and over because of the nefarious activities and posture of your utility companies. I kind of got tagged on that on this install and just discovered it this week. I wanted to do some experiments with our grid-tied inverters. And when I went to do it, I could not figure out how my own solar system worked. I recently mentioned that it appeared that Ameren UE was doing net billing instead of net metering. And by the way, in your community right now, they are trying to confuse you on this issue. I got a notice from Ameren UE to go support a law, which they did not provide a link to, that they guaranteed me would decrease my bills by 2.5%. And it turns out it was a attempt to very slyly convert net metering to net billing. So let's talk about what net metering is. Net metering is when you receive electricity from the utility company at 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. When you put back electricity into the utility, you offset that, you reverse the meter, and you can wind it back to zero, to where you don't owe anything at 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. You pay 12.5 cents to take it out, and you offset it at 12.5 cents when you put it back in. At the point where you reach zero, a net zero, then they have some kind of, I think, disingenuous malarkey about the avoided production cost. And so you would get, in our area, 2.4 cents for the net overage that you provide. Net billing is not net metering. It's designed to sound like net metering so that you will be confused. And they want you to be confused. Net billing is where whenever you take electricity from them, you pay 12.58 cents a kilowatt hour plus taxes. And whenever you produce anything at all that goes into the grid, you get the 2.4 cents. Now, I want you to keep that difference in mind as we go through our discussion of my system, because we had a meeting here 4 years ago with the local electrician, the solar company that was installing it, the city inspector, and the Ameren UE meter inspector. And I laid out what I wanted, what the objectives were, and how I wanted it to work, and asked if anybody had any objection to any part of that. Nope, they liked all that. That's how it works, Jack. I mean, I'm surprised you would even bring it up. Of course, that's how it works. Yeah, we can do that. And they went off and came out to this room and argued for 3.5 days of how to do all that. There are some safety considerations. You have to have an outside shutoff and yada, yada. And I'm good with all that. And they notified me that they had worked it all out and everybody was happy and they were going to sign it off. And they did the install and they signed it off. And if they're happy, I'm happy. You need to pay attention. It's odd that people would do this. Here is a little box. I have 5 strings of 16 Rent-A-Solar 305 watt panels in series, delivering about nominally 450 volts. These little flexible metal conduits take them to each of my 5 grid-tied inverters. I can push a little button and light this up. Right now, I'm making a whopping 177 watts there, 153. It's raining like a cow pissing on a flat rock right now outside. Out of these 5 come 5 AC circuits that go over to this combiner panel. It looks like a normal circuit breaker panel, but it's a photovoltaic AC inverter combiner panel. And this is 240 volts AC. It's not DC. These have turned it into AC. And I have inverter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And they combine it into a single circuit, 240 volts AC. That's one phase, L1, a neutral, N, and a second phase, L2. It is 120 volts between each phase and the neutral, and 240 volts AC RMS between the 2 phases, and that's US power. And that goes down and out the wall. This is our meter panel with our trick meter here. Ameren UE. And below it are 2 disconnects, 200 amps each, and they are both off right now. The behind this panel is where we go into the wall with the power. Here you can see our power coming out the combiner box for our 5 grid-tied inverters, and it goes across here to this box right next to the meter where it's easy to locate. And this is a exterior switch panel. If we pull that lever down, I could open it up and show it to you, but I also cut off my grid-tied inverters. So if we pull this handle down, if the building's on fire or something, you pull this handle down and our grid-tie inverters go completely down. And so that's our exterior setup for the grid tie, and our loop out from our combiner box up through this exterior switch, disconnect, and back into the building. And it comes in, it goes through a safety shutoff switch on the outside of the building. And it comes in here, and it goes into this solar AC utility tap box through this portal right here. This portal is actually tied to our meter base that has 2 200 amp disconnect switches on it, and one of them feeds this box. This box then has grid power, and it has my 5 grid-tied solar circuits, and that goes to this circuit breaker box, as it turns out. Wow. I've got one 240 AC circuit breaker of quantity 40 amps, and I have a 110 that's lights in the showroom, 30 amps, and I have a 60 amp, and those are air conditioning, and 2 15s, and stuff like the wireless router and some fluorescent lights in this room run on all that. And without the air conditioning on, I'm probably using 500 watts. Huh. Well, that's good, isn't it? Because anything over the 500 watts is going to go out through the meter, and I'm going to be paid 2.4 cents for it. There is another circuit from the meter, and it comes down on the outside of the wall to the circuit breaker panel over there. That's where 90% of the shop circuits are hooked up to. All the EV charging, all the lifts, all the lights, the refrigeration, the coolers in the next room, and it goes to a panel in the next room that you've seen me working with, and all the circuits in there. And then it goes from that panel to another panel in the back room where we did the battery testing, and it goes to a panel there, and in fact it goes down in the basement to a panel there. So that's fed by a tube to the outside, and it comes across and goes to that panel. I'm going to put up a diagram here, and we call this diagram how not to design a 25 kilowatt grid-tied photovoltaic system. This is actually so evil, it is brilliant, and I kind of admire it. This is not, Ameren UE did not do this to me. This is a local building inspector. I have some rental property. I know the guy. He's a horse's ass, and he doesn't like me in the first place. And he really doesn't like it that his company has to pay $2 a watt for me to have a solar system. So he got with the electricians and the solar installers and worked this system out, And where he couldn't baffle them with bullshit, he dazzled them with brilliance. You see, my grid-tied system powers this panel that has nothing on it most of the year outside of July and August when we turn an air conditioner on that only air conditions the set room up front, which we're never in anymore. So it doesn't even come on. At 500 watts, and 24 kilowatts goes out through the meter at 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. And it travels almost an inch and a half to come back through the meter and go to my entire shop at 12.58 cents per kilowatt hour plus taxes. This guy has got me set up to produce my own power and pay them for the privilege plus the governmental taxes on it. Had I taken that bill that looks like we have net billing instead of net metering to the PUC, man, would I have been embarrassed. And I kept looking at that bill and thinking about doing that, and I kept saying to myself, something isn't right. I need to look at this further. That's a written tariff. They would get in a shit pot full of trouble for this. Something's not right. Well, I've got it now. Their billing is perfect. My system's dicked up. Now here's the one that drives me crazy. There's nothing I can say about it. If I go to Ameren or go to the PUC about what this man has done, what's his story? I signed off on the meter base. That's his system. He designed that. That's his inside plant. I didn't have anything to do with that. And he's right. I should have been paying better attention, huh? Because I can't say anything about it. It's not even worth bringing it up. It's a brilliant move to basically cause me to be my own power plant, to sell the power to them at 2.4 cents. They route it an inch and a half and right back in through my same meter to the electricity I'm using at 12.58 cents. I mean, how good is that? You got to admire it. It's fantastic. So here's what we did to fix it. We took out the circuit along the outside wall that came in here and went to that circuit breaker panel. And on our side of the wall, we put another tap in here and ran it on this new conduit across the room to that panel. And it's all perfectly legal, and it's perfectly right. All safety switches are still in place. All anti-islanding is still in place, and we're all good, and they can say nothing about it. But now, if I produce power, I'll at least get to use it without looping it through their meter so I can pay them for the privilege of using my own power. So that's where we're at. The reason, and here is a diagram of our revised fixed system, and you'll have to look carefully to see what we did. We simply changed that one link from going outside, and so now we feed off the same 200, which is twice what I need anyway, and the other one isn't hooked up to anything. And we tap out of this box and go over to our main circuits. And so that's how that works. And so that is the nefarious tale of how I allowed and trusted some professional people to act like professionals and do an install. And I got to tell you that at this point, you need to be, this is a good lesson. And here's why. The costs of the panels have come down. The costs of the inverters have come down. But the costs of acquiring a customer haven't really. The costs of permitting have not really. And so when we used to put in $100,000 worth of equipment, if you paid a solar installer $15,000 to do that, it was perfectly reasonable. When you're putting in $25,000 worth of equipment, paying somebody $15,000 to put it in almost doesn't make any sense. And so you're going to have to start doing more of it your own self if you want to take advantage of the dramatic decreases in the cost of solar. But if you do have somebody to do it, you need to be very knowledgeable about what they're doing, because unfortunately that's become a competitive business, and they're lying to stay in business. Right now, you can find all over the internet estimates of what it costs to put in residential solar, and most of the solar installers will tell you $3.50. And the Solar Industries Association has got it at more like $1.95 to $2.10. And so my $63,000 system 4 years later should be about $48,000 to put it in. And that's where we're really at. But going forward, it's going to be more difficult for solar installers to make the largish margins that they had on lower equipment amounts. And you're going to have to become more knowledgeable about what you're installing. The other thing I want to point out is this 3%, which is where all this started. Wasn't really trying to rewire my shop. I stumbled across that. Here's the interest. 3% of the solar systems have any energy storage, and most of that is really what we'll call supremo lamo energy storage. With recent weather events, what I smilingly call the zombie apocalypse event, as it turns out, the zombies are really just people who can't charge their cell phones after a winter storm on the East Coast. But after 2 days of not being able to use their cell phones, they start to look a little zombie-like. The hurricanes, the flooding in Houston, wildfires in California, and some other events have kind of put a point on basically the fact that our utility companies have decreased their investment in maintaining the grid. And where they used to go out in 2 days and get everybody fixed up after a storm, now it's 2 weeks or 2 months, or in the case of Puerto Rico, maybe sometime next year. And so large swaths of the population, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people, can be without electricity for a couple of weeks. After Hurricane Sandy, those poor people in New Jersey were 45 days without electricity. And so why is that an issue? Well, they all go get home generators and fire those up, and they don't want to lose the electricity, so they refill the gas tank with a generator running, and you have fires breaking out all over the city. It's like a fireman's nightmare. It's just a mess. There has to be a better way. And what I'm about right now is I think we need battery backup for our solar. We need it on a global scale. We need it on a national scale. We need it on a state scale. We need it on a city scale. And you need it in your home. And we need a lot of it. We need to come to grips with the fact that there is plenty of energy now from the sun to power everything we're doing, but it gets a little thin at night or on days like today when we have very bad weather. And so we need to develop a strategy for converting to a realistic solar energy storage scenario that is not to keep your freezer going for a day, but means taking care of your electricity needs 24/7, 365 days a year. And what does that look like, sound like to me, is Tesla has ever made 300,000 cars, all put together, ever, including the Roadsters, the Model S's, the Model X's. That's in the US, in China, in Norway, all of them together, 300,000. They're talking about building, and I believe they will build, 500,000 Model 3s by this time next year. We've gone hockey stick on the electric cars. I've worked at it for 10 years. We won, guys. It's over. You don't. If you build an electric car now, it's because you like a '69 Camaro and you want the pride and workmanship of renovating that car to an electric standard that can last for 50 years and showing it to people. And that, by the way, that's a good mission. But the acculturation necessary to take us into magnetic drive for personal transportation has been done. It's over. There's nothing I can add to that going forward. But I believe that the batteries from those cars represent our best shot at economical storage of solar electricity. And we're going to go into consumer numbers on the cars, which means more wrecks. And fortunately, the batteries in the cars are warranted for 8 years and 100,000 miles. I have one of the first Tesla Model S's built, and it will be under battery warranty until 2021, 3 years from now. That means that essentially all the Teslas out there have batteries under warranty, and there is no market for the batteries from wrecked Teslas. There's no automotive market for them, but there is a repurpose of them for the purposes of backing up a house. 75 kilowatt hours is a pretty hefty amount of battery storage. I would recommend 2 of them for 150, but I'm an electricity hawk. You could certainly get by with 1. And I love what Thomas Massey did in Kentucky with his house, but I'm sorry, he's a double E from MIT. He can take a Tesla battery apart, rearrange it, put it back together, and get his 48-volt system that works with his house. I advocate taking the battery off the car, putting it in a truck, taking it home, putting it in the backyard, building a Lowe's tool shed around it, and wiring the sucker up to your house. And that's what we're working on here. But understand, most of the houses that already have solar, who are early adopters and low-hanging fruit, people who are enthusiasts and believe in that technology as being the way into the future of a better planet, have grid-tied systems. They've already invested in the grid-tied system and are in the embarrassing situation that if the grid goes down, The sun's shining on their 18 kilowatt array on their roof, and they don't have enough electricity to charge their cell phone at 5 volts and 1 amp anywhere in the place. Let's fix that. And so the inquiry into grid-tied inverters and off-grid inverters and electric vehicle batteries. Let's take a look at that, because I found something last week that is utterly astounding, and I don't think anybody else in the world knows about it. I'm going to share it with you. Not sure what you're going to do with it, but it's very interesting. Stay with us. Fire it up. Here we are in the dark. That's not where you want to be when dealing with solar. I have disconnected our shop from the grid by setting the two 200 amp disconnects in the meter base to off. Only one of them actually does anything anymore, since we've disconnected the one circuit from it and kind of unified our system here in the shop. I have a 20 kilowatt Chinese inverter here. I'm kind of swinging the door so you can see it. And 2 Tesla batteries that are connected in parallel to the input of that. Now those are 300 to 400 volt batteries. And it's a real simple inverter that takes a 300 to 400 volt input, converts it to our 240 volts AC with one 120 amp phase, a second that is 180 degrees out, and a neutral that they share. And that's L1, L2, and N in the US, and that's how we do electrical power here. In our box, we have some circuit breakers that go from one phase to neutral, others that go from the other phase to neutral, and those circuit breakers provide 120 volts AC to our wall outlets. If you bridge both of the phases, you get 240 volts AC in a neutral. And I have a 100 amp circuit breaker in that box that the output of our Chinese inverter is connected to. Normally, I would set the disconnect at the top to off and use the inverter to just power the things here in this little bit of the shop, off our test array on the roof and playing with the batteries, and that's what I've been doing quite a bit of. Today, I have that disconnect on, and I have that circuit breaker on, and if I turn on our Chinese inverter, we are now powering the entire shop. Here you can see phase A. It's kind of building up. I've got 60 hertz at 119.6 volts, about 6 amps, and that gives me 640 watts. And if I go to phase B, I also have 60 hertz, 120.2 volts, about 13 amps, and about 1,500 watts. And so that's what? About 2,000, 2,100 watts, all told, in the thing. On the laptop, here is a display of one of the batteries, and I can see that it's putting out about 4 amps at 336.7 volts. I'm at about 21% state of charge, and my cells are at 3.51 volts. On my laptop here, I can see that we're on the second battery, also at 336.72 volts, and we're discharging 5.22 amps. Note and remember that I said that we're discharging, and I know that because it's showing a negative current value. The way my software is set up, it shows discharge is a negative value and charge is a positive value. For about 2,000 watts, well, 1,700 watts there. And so over here we're at 2,100 and 650, so about 2,750 watts. Let's try an experiment. Let's go in the other room. Here we are at our grid-tied inverters. My first official act is going to be able to switch this one on. And have a little button on here where I can light the display. Takes it a minute. And we're at 237 volts. And 425 DC volts, 237 AC volts, and 0 power. And we have waking up remaining 291. Now we're disconnected from the grid. And so this has no grid power to sync to. But we now have power from our Chinese 20 kilowatt inverter. And I am advised by everyone on YouTube, every solar installer website, and every document I can find on the internet, not to ever try to sync a grid-tied inverter to a off-grid inverter, and for various reasons, all of which sound pretty good. Let's talk a little bit about how these work. In the first place, they check for a sinusoidal waveform, and they're really pretty picky. It has to be between 59.5 or 59.3 and 60.5, maybe 60.7 hertz. And if it is, it will sync up and start producing power at the same rate. It tends to want to produce it at just a little bit higher voltage, and that is so that you use the power from the grid tie inverter in preference to the power from the grid. You want to first use your solar power and augment that from the grid as needed. And so if your load is so big that your grid-tied inverter cannot keep up, we have 180 seconds left. This one has about a 4-minute wake-up time, and that's almost mandated, but some of them I've seen as low as 2. And so this will produce a higher voltage. If it can't produce as much as our load, that voltage will sag and will be held up by power from the grid. So by making it a little bit higher than the waveform that it detects, it becomes the source for the power in preference to the grid. And if the load is such that it can't maintain that gap, it will fall as it produces power to the grid level. And at that point, the grid will start to add power proportionally to maintain the regulated 240 volts. Now here's the problem, and that is the grid provides an infinite load. If this produces more power than we need, and we are powering all of our loads, and this is a 5 kilowatt unit, let's say it's producing its full 5 kilowatts, and we're using 4 kilowatts of it, it will maintain the voltage 3 or 4 volts above the grid level that it's syncing to. And that will cause any excess power to go out into the grid and power the neighborhood. In that sense, the grid is an infinite load. And so this simply puts out as much power as it can. And when it can't cover all of our loads, the grid supplements it. And if it produces more than our loads, it goes out to the grid. And it kind of relies on the fact that the grid is constantly an infinite load. It's the whole world. If we disconnect from the grid and this produces more power than we need, where is that to go? And it will keep raising the voltage, trying to offload that power to the grid to a maximum on this device of 264 volts. In theory, that will blow up most of your off-grid inverters, probably not ours. And so I don't know where the power goes at that point, and we want to find out. And so we're going to experiment with it under the theory that Jack can afford to blow up a Chinese inverter just to see what it looks and smells like. And so that's what we're doing here. Still have a minute to go down and see. I'm hearing some clicks. And some power. And let me put some video on that for you, if I can get my phone to work. And here we go. A little bit of glare there. Looks to me like we're doing about 760 watts. 238 volts here. And so you can see that we're actually under our grid voltage, which in this case is the 240 volts of the Chinese inverter. And for that reason, I think we can turn on another one. And we're going to fire this up and see what it does. Maybe. Yep. Here we go. And that power will, of course, vary with our sunlight. Now, the question is, where does the power go when the Chinese inverter is down to providing almost nothing, and this one is providing all our loads? As I recall, we needed about 2,600 watts. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the third one. We just don't have that much sun right now. We're at 600 or 800 watts here on this one. And so with 3 and this amount of sun, we should see something come up, but it's going to take us about 300 seconds or 5 minutes to power these up and see what happens. Okay, here we are back at our Chinese inverter, and I'm at 60 hertz, 119.9 volts on phase B, and 3 amps for about 75 to 90 watts. And I'm at 120.3 volts and 5.6 amps for 550 watts. So I'm making about 600 watts with the Chinese inverter, and probably 2,400 watts with the off-grid inverters, the Solar Edge. And indeed, I'm showing a battery current here of 0.08 amps and about 0 on the other one. And again, this battery is about 25% state of charge. The other one's showing 21, but I get a little out of sync with the Tesla thing. So let me make a little video to cut in here. Here's our screen. And here is our little EVTV display. And here, of course, is our Chinese display. 575 watts. And, oh goodness, 40 watts, 50 watts here. Maybe. And so there we go. We're kind of trimmed out where we're just making a little tiny bit of power with our Chinese inverter, it looks like. And most of it with our off-grid inverters. And so we're not using much out of our batteries. Isn't that cool? I've actually got the test array on the roof turned off because I want to see what happens with the off-grid inverters and my 24,400 volt array on that side. Let's go back and turn on some more grid-tied inverters. See what happens. While we move from the other room to this one, I found out I've just purchased my first Model 3 wreck for $22,600 on Copart. And we're going to try to get that in here and take it apart a little bit and see what's inside and see how many of the broken pieces we can figure out. Meanwhile, I have turned on all 5 of our grid-tied inverters. This one's putting out 924 watts. This one 902. That's 1,826. And 865. And that's about 2,700 total. And 895. And that's about a little under 3,600 total. And here's 976, and that's about 45 or 4,600 watts total. And we're up to about 242.5 volts. That one's 242.8. And so let me get you a little video close-up of that. Here is 917 and 895 and 852 and 887 and one that's dark, but we can bring it up at 971. And so again, we're our voltage when we weren't doing as much as we had load, we were 238 volts, which is below the 240 of the Chinese inverter. Now we're at 242.6. You can type yourself smart on the internet, and you can even make videos that you're a very authoritative source on this, and I believe you, except we live in southeast Missouri, and you have to show me. There's a couple things wrong with their theory. One is the spec sheet on this lists 264 volts as being the maximum voltage of these. It's my belief that if you ran these into no load, they would go to 264 volts and simply stop, putting out zero current at their maximum voltage. That's how I would do it if I was designing these. But let's ignore that for the moment and go take a look at our Chinese charger. We have 4,500 or so watts of power at 243 volts pretty much in here. Let's take a look in the other room. Here we are back at the Chinese inverter. I have my 60 hertz, 120.7 volts, 10.6 amps for about 1,220 watts. On phase B, if I go to A, I'm about the same voltage, about 120.7, 14.5 amps, and 1,700 watts. Oh, wait a minute. 1,250, 1,750, that's 3,000 watts. I'm making 4,500 watts in the other room. Instead of going down, our Chinese inverter is going up. We're making 3,000 watts here, 4,500 watts in the other room. That's 7,500 watts, but we're not connected to the grid. Where's the power going? We're only using 2,500. I have 5,000 watts rattling around in the room here, and I don't know where it's gone. We should see smoke. We should see fire. We should see something, because 5,000 watts simply can't go up in smoke, guys. Well, actually it can, but I need some smoke. So what's happening to the power? Now, when we did this last week, it was more like 2,500 watts per grid-tied inverter and about 10 kilowatts on the Chinese inverter for 25,000 watts. It was a little scary because we were still using 2,500 or 2,700 watts here in the shop. And so it posed a little bit of a puzzle. I look at my screen and I see 9 amps. I see 3,000 watts here. That's about what we're making. And then we're 1,900 and 1,400. We're up to about 3,300 watts here. And so we're doing 3,100 here, probably the other out of the other battery. So where's the power going? Power just doesn't, this isn't magic. It has to go somewhere. We're disconnected from the grid. And what happened last week was this sort of drove me crazy for about 45 minutes. And I'm picking my nose with one hand, digging at my ass with the other. And then I would change hands and then change back. And no matter what I did, I couldn't get the math to work out. Now, if I take the voltage of the battery, 338 volts, and the current on the battery, that comes out to this power, and it's showing up over here. So I believe all this. You know, it's a different current at 240 amps, 240 volts AC, than it is at 338 volts DC. I've got that. That makes sense. So all that works. But I've got meters in the other room where those grid-tied inverters think they're making, in this case, what was it, 950 watts apiece. And there's 5 of them. So somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 watts. And this Chinese inverter thinks it's making 1,600 and 2,100. So that's 3,700 watts. What's going on? Well, looking at my laptop, and I can show you this, there is something strange that I finally noticed. Let's see if you can catch it. Here's the laptop screen, and I'm seeing 338.72 volts, 10.26 amps, and 3,474 watts. It's all part of God's plan. And over here, I got 1,680 watts, 1,690, 2,200. It's all part of God's plan. Let's go back to the screen here. How many amps? 10.14 amps of current. Is that right? .15 amps of current. Didn't we say when we're discharging that current is negative? How can we have positive current? What does positive current mean on a battery? We're charging the battery. If we make 4,500 or 5,000 watts on the grid-tied inverters, and we're showing 2,150 and 1,500, that's 3,600 watts. What we have is an inverter that's designed to show us our current and our power. It's designed to make power and put it out. It doesn't have a negative symbol on it. We're measuring power that's coming into our Chinese inverter and being fed into our battery as a very stable and very nice DC voltage. And we're charging our battery. Our Chinese inverter apparently has a battery charger in it that the Chinese didn't tell me about, that somehow is mysteriously, automatically charging my batteries. I know. Let's change to a different brand inverter from a different manufacturer that I know doesn't have a battery charger in it. Let's try it. We going? All right. Here we are with our Sandy SDP 10 kilowatt inverter, and we have brought back up our grid tie inverters. Actually, I didn't change anything on the switching. They simply went through the same 5-minute power up. We've lost a little bit of sun. We're down to about 700 watts per grid tied inverter. And my Sandy's showing 243 volts AC out, and AC out of 5.8 amps right now, 60 hertz. And on my laptop, I'm showing 3.57 amps positive current into the battery. Now, the Sandy doesn't have a charger. I was never told that the Deming did either. In fact, I've done some checking, and they don't have any battery chargers in them. But here we are, charging all of our excess power above what we need, did find a place to go, and that's right back into our batteries, which are used as a load. And so we're not only operational, but advantageously operational with our grid-tied inverters putting out power, and with our full shop powered up. And here we are making power. We can do anything we want, including charge cars or whatever. The other day, through the Sandy, I actually had 15 kilowatts of power coming into the battery through a 10 kilowatt inverter. And it did it for 20 minutes. It did shut down. And when I reached across it to reset the circuit breaker, which had tripped, it was hot on my arm. So you don't really want to run a 10 kilowatt inverter at 15 kilowatts for very long, but it'll do it. And in fact, it'll do it backwards. Now, wait a minute. How can this be? How did our inverter turn into a charger? And why is it such a well-behaved charger? Well, it brings up the question then, what happens when our battery gets full? Well, let's try that. I know what will happen when the battery gets full because I programmed the battery. It's going to trip the contactors. And so let's just turn off our negative contactor here with a lowercase n and turn off the other battery. And we go dark. Nobody's making any power. You see, the grid-tied inverters still do need power to sync to. And they're always going to. So, if I get to a full battery, my battery will just shut off and we'll be done. Of course, I got no power. Now, if I go in the other room and turn off my grid tie inverters, and I hit capital N here on my contactor, it looked almost like our dimming came on. It was actually our Sandy, and it comes on. I actually read the voltage and frequency on the dimming, but it's not hooked up to a battery, or it's not turned on. And so we're back to putting out about 24 amps and a minus 11 amps on our battery. as we power the shop from the inverter, and that will continue for 5 minutes until those grid-tied inverters come back on. So that's very interesting in that we can make more power than we need using the grid-tied inverters, and we have a place to put it in the batteries. But the amazing discovery is that our inverters will charge our batteries quite automatically without any intervention from us, because if it had taken any, I would have never known to try it. It just happened. One of those serendipitous discoveries. All that begs the question, why did it happen? And how did it happen? Well, I've said several times that the 300 to 400 volts DC is a much better voltage to use for our inverter to make 240 volts AC. Now, how do I know that? Well, because we kind of come to 300 to 400 volts DC, because that's a very handy DC voltage to make from 240 volts AC. If you rectify 240 volts AC, you get about 320, 340 volts DC at the peaks. And so we can minimize the cost and the size of our passive components like inductors and capacitors if we're going to build a charger to charge at some voltage in that wheelhouse. And 300 to 400 volts DC is very handy. We could go to 800 volts DC from 240 volts AC. And that might be a very nice thing to do, and some people are playing with the idea of doing it, but you need much larger, much more expensive passive components to pump it uphill that far from its native 320 volts to 800 volts DC. Larger inductors and larger capacitors. And similarly, if we wanted to have a 48 volt car, we could jack it down to 48 volts, but the same thing applies. Larger and more expensive passive components. So we got to 300 to 400 volts DC because we're going to charge it from 240. And if we're going to make 240, guess what is the perfect voltage to make that from? And that's kind of in the wheelhouse of 300 to 400 volts DC. If, for example, we were going to run this inverter off a 48 volt DC battery, we kind of have to run a boost converter using an inductor and a capacitor and at least one switch, and really two capacitors. And they need to be pretty good size because we're going to pump the energy into the inductor, transfer it to the capacitor, and we're going to do that with the switch over and over and over. Well, that kind of blocks the whole thing, but I don't really need all that circuitry if I'm going to run off of 300 to 400 volts DC. So why put it in a box? I'm going to put a thing up on the screen here. This is called a simplified H-bridge 240 volt AC inverter. And what I want you to notice here is that we have a battery of 365 volts, 4 switches. They call it an H-bridge because the active switching routes current across the H-bar, which in this case have kind of displaced and made it the primary of TX1. If I turn on switch Q2 and Q3, I'll get current up through, from the negative side of the battery, up through Q2, up through the primary, and up through Q3 to the positive side of the battery. If I switch those two off and turn on Q1 and Q4, My current route is from the negative side of the battery up through Q4 to the top of TX1's primary, down through the primary and across and up through Q1 to the battery. And we're going to switch that back and forth, of course, to do our positive and negative around 0. And the secondary of the transformer is split. I often call this split phase, but it's split where L1 is at one end, L2 is at the other, and then the neutral is the center tap. And that's where we get our 240 volts AC. Of course, we can step up or step down that voltage in a fixed ratio depending on what the number of turns of the windings are. But as I say, 365 volts DC, our nominal battery voltage, is in the wheelhouse. Now, how do we actually make that sinusoidal waveform? Is with a series of pulses at a fairly high frequency, 10 to 14 kilohertz. And we vary the pulse width of each of those pulses with a very narrow pulse width giving us a low voltage and a very wide pulse width giving us a high voltage. And so we'll start with a very narrow pulse width and grow it, as it gets wider, our sign goes up. And as we narrow that, it goes down. And so to be on one side of it, we take Q1 and Q4 and we switch them through this widening pulse width to a narrowing one to give us one side of our sinusoidal waveform. And then we switch and use the other switches, Q3 and Q2, and we do the same thing on the negative side. And so we're actually connecting the transformer primary to our battery using a pulse width modulation at 10 to 14 kilohertz to produce a waveform through the transformer at a much slower 60 hertz. And doing this in software with a microcontroller, I can very precisely derive the voltage and the frequency of that output. Now here's the funny thing. The transformer has no sense of direction. It's kind of like a 22-year-old. It will take current one way or power the other way, and it's going to couple it across either time. Those IGBT switches are kind of the same thing. The direction of the current flow is not necessarily fixed. And we have body diodes in with each of the switches that would naturally work a little bit like rectifiers anyway. So we're in a little over my pay grade. You guys tell me. Are we charging through the switching action of those IGBTs, or are we rectifying through the body diodes? It probably doesn't matter. A lot of you say the body diodes would be worn out very quickly. I don't think so. They've, in recent years, they just keep making them bigger and a higher current value because of failures. And today they very nearly approach the level of the switches. But we have to be switching, because if we miss a lick on that 60 hertz, all of our grid-tied inverters go offline. And so if I lose the battery or do anything with the inverters, that the off-grid inverter, the grid ties simply drop offline. So that's what I think is happening. I actually think it's going back through the switches. I could be wrong. I'm the only person on YouTube and on the internet who actually could be wrong, technically. I've surveyed it, and everybody else on the internet is an absolute authority on everything, and their words are true, if somewhat in conflict with each other. But in this case, I think I can demonstrate charging of the battery using the grid-tied inverters somehow through that off-grid inverter, which has no circuitry in it to account for charging the batteries. The sun's brightening a little bit. I'm up to 6 amps coming into the battery, about 14 at AC. Do the math. This is all part of God's plan. 14 at 240, 6 at 338, or 338. And we're coming up a little bit in our state of charge as we actually charge the battery from our Rent-A-Solar photovoltaics on the other side of the shop through our Solar Edge grid-tied inverters. And so the concept that you can't use grid-tied inverters with an off-grid inverter to provide the waveform to sync to is demonstrably not true, even at some scale. Now, I can see kind of why they get to this. If you take a little 300-watt cheapo 12-volt battery and inverter and try to sync your grid tie 25 kilowatt system to it, there could be some problems. And I would say, as I said, we overheated this 10 kilowatt inverter. It works a lot better with the 20 and stays cooler. But we can charge our batteries and swing both ways entirely off the grid and making full use of our 24,400 or 800 watts of Rent-A-Solar grid-tied plant in this way. And the reason I think that's important is, as I described earlier, 97%, at least 97% of all the residential solar installations, light industrial solar installations in the United States now are grid tied and lose power. If you lose grid power, they have nothing. Using this technique, they could disconnect from the grid manually, bring up their off-grid inverter, and instead of powering 3 or 4 critical loads with a 24 or 48 volt battery, they can power their whole house just as it always is, as long as the sun shines. And if you want to use a Tesla battery, pretty much power your house all night off of the battery. And so I think it's a big deal, and it's a big deal toward using electric vehicle batteries as the necessary storage for solar power going into the future, and in enabling homes and businesses that have grid-tied solar already or want grid-tied solar to be able to do a backup strategy that actually makes sense and can work. And can work in the zombie apocalypse. Frankly, I have the grid disconnected. If we never hooked it back up again, it would be okay. We would have power. And if we did hook it up and we did push power out to the grid, it probably means $27 a month, and I got $100,000 in solar around here. This is why selfish solar is important. Y'all are chasing the concept of making money off your roof, which I agree is a delightful concept, but it's technically and economically absurd. Give it up. The grid is going to abuse you and beat you half to death with this little dream of getting money from them instead of giving money to them. They provide an admirable service. They do a reasonably good job of it. And you ought to just go ahead and pay the $9 a month to be connected to them and use their power when you need to. But generally speaking, I think we should work toward a total independence from that grid for our personal power needs and generate power at the point of use. And that requires batteries. It's always about the batteries. And it is at the individual tiny house nation cabin in the Montana woods scale, and it is on a global scale. And at any scale in between, the problem is going to be the same and the solution is going to be the same. But we've kind of found some serendipitous, fortuitous happenstance here this week at EVTV in that using cheap transformer-based inverters that don't have a bunch of DC conversion circuitry on the front end is actually a huge advantage in that we can take grid-tied inverters and charge batteries with them. Where does this need to go? Well, I don't really want to shut off my battery when it gets full. In the first place, I really don't want it to get full. I want it to charge to 51% state of charge and discharge 49% state of charge forever. But I don't get that. So what happens if it does get full? We need a better strategy than manually shutting everything down and bringing up just the grid-tied inverter. That works, by the way, and it's not a big deal, but we need a better strategy. What would that be? I need an inverter where when the battery gets full, I can shift the frequency. If I could shift the frequency below that 59.5, but some of them go as low as 58.5. If I can shift that frequency to 58 hertz, the grid-tied inverters would go down and I'd be using power from the battery, not putting it in. Or if I could shift it to 62 hertz, it would do the same. Well, you say, well, Jack, that's going to throw off everything in my house. My clocks are based on that 60 hertz. Not since about 1980. If you have a clock that runs on an AC waveform for timing, you need a new clock. Get an iPhone. They have a clock in it. Or get a tablet. It has a clock in it. Everything else in your house, every motor, every computer, everything, it doesn't care even if you're 50 hertz. Now your motors, your fan motor and your furnace will run a little slower at 50 hertz, but it'll work fine. So if I can just shift that frequency output of my off-grid inverter 2 hertz, I have one green ball in my right hand and one green ball in my left hand. And that gives me complete control of the Jolly Green Giant. And that's where we want to be. So that's our best strategy. If we could control those inverters either wirelessly or by I think the best approach is that frequency phase shift. Of course, I could take my battery charge enable output and run it across the building and have a contactor on the input to each of the Solar Edge inverters, and that would work fine. Simply switch a relay that switches 12 volts to, I could actually turn them all off that way. I'd need like 5 inputs if I want to tune it. So that, but that could be done. to where you turn off one or two of them as you get full, and that would be nice. But my sense is that the Solar Edge, there's a lot of people use in phase, use the Magnum GT 500s. There's some other microinverters out there. There's some other full-size and grid-tied inverters out there. But all of them have to be within a certain very narrow range of that 60 hertz, or they drop off. And my sense is if we could get an inverter where I could take a 12-volt signal out or a serial output and get it to shift phase, that might be the best option. There is a suspicion that I hold and have some basis for that some inverters out there, if you shift it slightly off frequency, it decreases the output instead of shutting down. And if you shift it a little bit more, it decreases it a little bit more. And that would truly be ideal if we could actually control the frequency of an inverter to modulate the power output of these grid-tied inverters. That would be fantastic. But if we could just slip it 2 hertz and shut them off, that would be adequate. So there's a lot of ways to go and a little fine-tuning of this, but the basic concept works right now as I speak. We can do this at EVTV. We can run a Chinese off-grid inverter and use that to sync our 5 Solar Edge grid-tied inverters and make all the power we need. And in fact, if we make more power than we need, we can store it in our batteries. And that's what we want to do during the day so we can run at night and achieve a level of independence from the grid entirely. So it's been kind of an adventure. I wanted to test the grid-tied inverters. That caused me to look at our installation and found the horror that I had been selling power to myself and giving the money to Ameren UE for 4 years. We got that straightened out, and now we're taking a look at just how far this goes, how many different inverters actually will let me charge in reverse when they think they're inverting. In fact, they're still displaying power. It's just power coming in, and they don't have sense enough in their sensors to know that it's a negative value. And that's what you get into with this simple components. That's why I like simple components. If we're going to have any brains, microcontrollers, Bluetooth, all that, I want it in the batteries themselves. The batteries should know about the batteries. Everybody else should tend to their own knitting and do their job. And if you're an off-grid inverter, you ought to make power off-grid. And if you're a grid-tied inverter, you ought to make power when you have something to sync to. And there shouldn't be a whole lot of configuration of those items or necessary knowledge. And when you get it that way, it lets you do kind of a stereo component type mix and match. And the variable is what kind of batteries you have. That's always been one of the complicating facts. Well, the battery ought to know what kind it is. You get a battery, and it should have a controller that knows its characteristics and enables other equipment to basically dance to the battery's tune. And I believe that technically, the proper battery is the 300 to 400 volts if you want to do 240 volts AC. And I believe that economically, the source of those batteries is going to be from electric vehicles. Now, nothing stays simple. I just, as I said this afternoon, bought a car on Copart for $22,600, which, of course, in Copart speak is really $23,500, fees and so forth included. But that's for the first, I believe, the first Model 3 wreck that has come up for auction. And we'll get that in here. But my observation on my Model 3 is, guess what? We have a different battery. It seems to come in at about 247 volts. And so it's going to be a little bit different. But we have a wreck to play with, and we're going to get the battery out of it, and we're going to get the motor out of it. And we're going to go through it and try to find a place to develop a handy place to tap into the CAN buses and maybe develop our own OBD2 connector or something that you could backfit into a Model 3. And so it's pretty exciting times here at EVTV, and we'll get that car in and take that apart for you and continue from there. So we're having a party at EVTV pretty much every day, and I can't hardly sleep at night. There's so many exciting things happening around here. And so stay with us. There's going to be more